Welcome intro classes, period 1 and period 9. We are going to talk about multiplication and division today. There is a packet on the table near the door that should say multiply integers on it. Please make sure that the substitute hands one out so you can follow along. If you would like, you may pause the video and talk about which one of these three running tags doesn't belong. Okay, so we're going to try modeling multiplication problems. Now, one thing that's very important to know is that this symbol is the multiplication symbol. It's the same thing that you used to write the X for, and then you eventually did the multiplication dot. We're now going to just put them next to each other with parentheses because the parentheses mean multiplication. This written out means 4 groups of 3. So on your paper or on a piece of scratch paper, I'd like you to model 4 groups of 3. Most of you probably would have started out with 4 empty groups with 3 things in them. This is probably one of the first ways you learn to multiply numbers. When we look at this, if we read this out properly of 2 groups of -4, we could also see that we're going to have 2 open groups, and in those groups put in 4 negatives. 2 groups of -4 would result in -8. The same would go for the next one. 2 groups of -3. I would have 2 groups with 3 negatives in them. 2 groups of -3 result in -6. Please try to practice saying 2 groups of -3 instead of 2 times 3. It helps you have a better visual of what's happening. Now this is more difficult because you may say, how would I have a negative group? If you remembered the commutative property, the commutative property said that 3 groups of 5 was the same as 5 groups of 3. We could switch the order. That would also work for this. I could switch the order to 3 groups of -5. That would give you a nice visual of 3 groups with 5 negatives in them. 3 groups of -5 would be -15. Now, many of you may have already started to notice a pattern. If I have 1 negative, my answer is going to be negative. And I am doing normal multiplication, so nothing is changing. If I have 1 negative, my answer is negative. If I happen to have 2 negatives, this is slightly harder to model, but you still can. This first negative really means to remove. So if I were to read this properly, I would remove 2 groups of -4. Well, if we start out with a whole bunch of 0 pairs, like we did with addition and subtraction, you could look at it and say, I'm going to remove 2 groups of -4. Here's 1 group of -4 that I'm going to take out. Here's another group of -4 that I'm going to take out. And I'm left with a +8. So when you have 2 negatives, your answer is a positive answer. Which then goes into here the rules. When you multiply integers with the same signs, 2 positives or 2 negatives, the answer is always positive. When I multiply numbers with different signs, one is a positive and one is a negative, my answer is always negative. I always multiply like normal, I just need to watch the signs. Looking through in your packet further, you will see C, D, and E. Go ahead and solve those on your own while pressing pause on the video. When you press play, I will go over the answers. Okay, so for this one, I see two negatives. Two negatives is going to result in a positive product. 12 times 8 is 48, so my answer is 48. D, for those of you that may not remember, this is an exponent. This tells me how many groups of the base that I have. So this expanded out would be -5 times -5. I here again, I have two negatives. My negatives would result in a positive product. When there is more than one, we go to PEMDAS, 2 at a time. I start with my first product. -7 groups of -5 would result in 35, and then 35 times a -3. A positive and a negative would result in a negative. 30 times 3 is 90, 5 times 3 is 15, so add those together, that would be 105. You will have a couple of different story problems in your homework tonight. One will talk about the change and their story problems. So if we look at this one, it says, note for the change can be an increase or decrease. For an increase, use a positive number. For a decrease, use a negative number. A tram moved downward 3 meters per second. So that means it's a -3 meters for every second. If they go for that for 18 seconds, what is the total change? That would mean we would take our -3 times 18. 3 times 10 is 30, 3 times 8 is 24, 30 plus 24 is 54, so that would be a -54. If we look at the next one, a substance was heated by 18 degrees over a period of 3 hours. Now, for many of you, you may have to remember that as a fraction. 18 degrees for 3 hours. We would need to make this a unit rate because I want to know what was the change in 1 hour. And this actually keys us into our division. Division of 18 divided by 3 is also written as a fraction. And actually, we will see it written as a fraction most of the time here in intro. So I would take 18 divided by 3. 18 divided by 3 is 6. The same rules apply. If they're both positive, my answer is positive. Exponents, remember that this exponent tells you how many of the base that we have. So in this case, it would be -3 times -3 times -3. We would do our first set of -3. -3 times -3 gets 9, times the -3 gets us then -27. When evaluating with variables, always be sure to rewrite them first. -c, if c is 3, and -c would be -3 plus 3. This is multiplication, so we're going to write it as multiplication. Remember with PEMDAS, that multiplication comes first before addition and subtraction. So I would start with 3 groups of -2. That would get me -6. Then that is -3 plus a -6, which gets me -9. Again, with a variable, if that's 5 squared plus 9, that exponent says I have 2 groups of 5, so that would be 5 times 5 plus 9. Do the multiplication first, 25 plus 9, and that would then get us 34. Dividing is the same rules, but there are some zeros that are going to come up on our problems. If you continue in the packet, you should see some division rules, which I do not have, so I will come back down here. Those division rules are just like multiplication. When they are the same sign, if you have same signs, a negative 12 divided by a negative 2, that's going to result in a positive 6. Much like 6 divided by 2 will get you 3. If you are dividing with different signs, a negative 10 divided by 5, that would result in a negative 2. Or a 12 divided by a negative 3 would result in a negative 4. Last type of questions you're going to get is divide by 0. 0 divided by 6 is really mean, can you take nothing and share it into 6 equal parts? And the answer is yes. You get 0. 0 divided by 6 equals 0. I can share nothing with everybody, and everybody gets nothing. What's different is, can I take 6 pieces and divide it into 0? Can I take 6 and share it into nothing? And the answer is no. That is undefined. If you try that into your calculator, you will probably get domain error, error of 0, or syntax error. You cannot take a number and divide it by 6. That is undefined. You have an online assignment that has multiple retakes. It is due for you on Tuesday, 8 a.m. I will not require work on this. However, I will be available for questions throughout the day. This video will be up on the lesson plans where you found it, and you can access it from home. Thanks, guys.